Hello, everyone, and thanks again for joining the SAP community call today. My name is Svea Becker, and I'm from the SAP community team, and I'm your host today. And with me, I have Saptarshi Zen from SAP. He is a product owner at SAP, and he's currently taking care of application development for business partner, customer, and suppliers topics in S4HANA and S4HANA Cloud and on-premise editions. And in addition to that, he's also driving key projects on BP, CVI improvements, enabling SAP ERP customers to upgrade to SAP S4HANA. And that's also the topic for today. So welcome, Saptarshi. Welcome to our SAP community call. I'm really happy that you are here with your two colleagues. And you can just go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you, Svea. A warm welcome to all of you. This is Saptarshi, and today I'm going to talk about the S4HANA Movement Business Partner CVI project and our main deliverable called the CVI Cockpit. I'll start with a brief disclaimer, as the developments have just been released to the market. And followed by that, I'll just talk about the agenda of today. And I'll start with a brief motivation and a business context, followed by the utilities and the tools that have already been delivered. After that, we'll just briefly talk about what the new CVI cockpit does, followed by a system demonstration and some references, of course, followed by a detailed questionnaire. So just to quickly jump onto the topic, here to start with, I'm going to talk about the business partner and the CVI context as such. Now, we all are familiar with the customer and the vendor data models that we used to have during the ECC days. I'm sure we all are having a lot of ECC customers in today's day as well, where we are pretty much used to the traditional customer and the vendor business processes that typically run through the XD and the XK transactions. So I'll just briefly show a diagrammatic representation on how exactly we used to work and what is the to-be process with S4HANA Business Partner into the picture. So as you can see, we used to have a customer and a vendor having company code and sales area data, followed by the interfaces for customer and vendor data model, which would be persisted onto the KNA1 and the LFA1 related tables. And now with the S4HANA Business Partner in place, yes, although we want to simplify the overall data model persistence, we do have an intermediate step in between, which is what we are basically referring to as the CVI process. CVI, as the name suggests, is nothing but the customer and vendor integration. So what happens is with S4HANA now being in place, we basically push forward for business partner being the leading object, right? So what happens over here is whenever a customer or a vendor needs to be created, it is linked to a single business entity, which is the business partner. And the information about the fact that the same business partner can also be a customer as well as the vendor is basically taken care through the role synchronizations. So as some of you might already know, that we first in S4HANA would create a business partner and then assign the roles FLCU01 or an FLVN01 for creating a customer or a vendor roles. In return, once the business partner object is created, the customer and vendor APIs triggered by the CVI process would also take care to create the KNA1 and LFA1 entries in parallel. So this is a very brief diagrammatic explanation, which basically talks about the commit mechanism, which basically posts the business partner first, followed by the customer and the vendor object creations into the S4HANA database, right? So now with this slight paradigm change that we have with the S4HANA into the picture. There also comes along with it a slight complexity in the business processes, meaning since it's a mandate for S4HANA system upgrade, what we see over here is that there's a need for simplifying through some standard solution how this business partner synchronization is to be achieved seamlessly. Yep. So with respect to that, I'll just move on to the next slide, which talks about the utilities we have delivered as part of the S4HANA movement project. So we are talking about ECC EHP deliverables, wherein we basically talk about our ERP customers who are basically planning to upgrade to S4HANA in a short time frame from now, and who are basically interested in running an ECC to S4HANA conversion project. So as part of ECC EHP 8 SP12, we have already delivered something called a master data consistency check report. Just to talk a few lines around that, we all know that customer and vendor master data per se can be created and saved through XD and XK transactions in ECC, of course. However, for a BP synchronization, the system expects few additional data to be maintained in the customer and vendor data models itself in order to be successfully synchronized to the business partner. So this master data consistency check report is basically a tool that is offered to the customer, and he can run it at a very preliminary stage when he's just thinking around the conversion project as such, and he gets a clear idea around what are the number of errors that he needs to resolve in order to go through a smooth synchronization process. Now, many a times we also see that there are few of the checks which or few of the errors which are, let's say, for example, something to do with the postcode length or a particular tax type for a specific country. You know, certain checks or maybe, if not anything else, suggest for a one-time customer or a one-time vendor, let's say for the CPD account groups, to talk specific, some of the checks may not be relevant. So we've also provided a configurable option where certain field checks can also be suppressed during a pre-synchronization phase. And then with that, the synchronization cockpit pushes through the checks during the synchronization phase, and the business partner creations can be done. Now, what we had until then were more of standalone reports, and there was a lack of a standard guided process cockpit which could walk us through step by step and in a very guided and intuitive manner which sequence should be followed and which tools should be run at which point of time. So we thought of having this new CVI cockpit, and as you can see, it basically brings in the multitude of various CVI process components under one single standard guided cockpit. Some of the additional value adds which are also delivered as part of the CVI cockpit, of course, we're going to run through this in the system, are also this collective notes based on the TCI, which is nothing but transport based correction instructions, which basically simplifies installation of 100+ notes at a single shot rather than having to implement each note one by one. And we also basically offer an integration with another in-house program that we are having, which is called the Readiness Check Dashboard, which is again very specific to all our customers who are willing to upgrade to S4HANA, and they can basically see with respect to their overall reports or the overall readiness in terms of how they are moving towards a complete S4HANA upgrade, what are the main effort drivers, which lists the main effort drivers for them, keeping in mind the complexity of the conversion. Just to narrow down on our topic today, which is the CVI cockpit, I'd like to just briefly talk about the problem statement that we had been facing before the CVI cockpit was in place. Well, in the past, I'm sure many of the many of the people in the audience over here would also have noticed that there were standalone reports or notes, I mean, which were not exactly delivered as part of the standard feature set, but were delivered as individual notes, were existing pretty discreetly in the sense there was a problem reported and there were some notes delivered to fix those issues, and overall, from an end-to-end business process point of view, due to the lack of a standard mechanism, the complexity or the perception of CVI as a process, was slightly being slightly different on how it is actually. So what we basically thought of is to offer a single guided cockpit, which will be delivered as part of the standard feature set, which basically clubs in together in the intended sequence the right process components which are to be executed at a given point of time, and then runs into the synchronization phase, where you actually convert the customers and vendors and contact persons into business partners, followed by some additional features as well, which we are also going to look at in the upcoming slides to come. As you can also see, we also, through this, we basically address the gap of the lack of a standard structured sequenced guidance for the customers and consultants community who are willing to upgrade to S/4HANA. And the solution is what is the CVI cockpit, which is delivered as part of the standard enhancement pack 8 SP13. However, it doesn't really imply that the solution will only be available in the latest release. We are also making it available and making a proper downport mechanism so that this particular solution is available in all lower releases until ERP 6.0, SAP APPL 600. And it will also be available as part of a node, so that irrespective of which SP or which release version the customer or the consultant is in, the CVI cockpit can be made available in the system. Yeah, so with that, I will now move on to a brief process overview of the business partner CVI conversion project, which typically happens across the ECC landscapes, and what are the main steps that needs to be there in the system, and what are the sequence that needs to be followed, and how does that percolate into the system wherein we have delivered the central CVI cockpit now. So I'm sure for many of you could also relate to it already with the components that are highlighted over here. The customer and vendor synchronization process to business partner basically can start with considering you have a ECC box, and you may also have some integrated systems, for example, CRM system, which is most commonly seen across multiple customer landscapes. So basically, as a prerequisite, there are the system basically looks for a few pre-installed nodes for CRM integration and so on, some mandatory function modules to be activated and deactivated after the synchronization takes place. So a set of prerequisite nodes which is good to have in the system before you start off with the CVI synchronization process, and also some documentation and the help library nodes that you should have as a process know-how before you start off with the synchronization process. And then comes the preparation steps. Now, at this step, as I spoke, the first option that you see over here, the master data BP consistency checks, is something that we delivered in SP12 already. Now, this is a tool which basically lets you know that in total, let's say if you have 100 customers and 100 suppliers, how many of those 100 customers and suppliers are actually ready to be synchronized to BP? Now, when we say ready to be synchronized, we basically in the backend focus at two aspects. One is the master data checks, and the other is the customizing checks. Now, I'm sure you all also must have noticed that there are quite a few customizing checks in place if you want CVI and business partner synchronization to work through smoothly. So we basically need to distinguish between what is a functional master data inconsistency and what is a customizing inconsistency. So BP synchronization can only work only when both of these things are fulfilled, meaning the functional master data inconsistencies are also taken care, as well as the CVI customizing checks are also in place in the system. Followed by the fact that in case we feel that certain specific data sets or checks are not really relevant at this point of time, and where the customer is well aware that this data is something that he can deal with or live with it, even if this is percolated onto the S4 layer as well. So there is also a provision. Now, this is something which we typically run in the sandbox systems only, in the quality systems only, where we can actually suppress few of the checks during the synchronization cockpit, which basically allows the end user to run through a smooth customer and vendor synchronization to business partner. Then comes the actual synchronization phase, where we basically activate and deactivate few interfaces, few function modules, and then we block and release a few customer and vendor transactions, meaning when the synchronization is happening, we actually would block any customer or vendor creation at that very moment, followed by a release of the same when we are done with the synchronization cockpit. Then comes the real CVI load via the MDS load cockpit, followed by MDS PPO2, which is basically a reprocessing framework for the errors which are captured during the synchronization cockpit. And then we basically move on to the next stage, which is a pre-upgrade check. Now, I'm going to talk about all of this in much more details when I run into the system, but just at a theoretical level, I just wanted to briefly mention how the business process looks like in today's date. And then we'll basically correlate how that has been brought onto the system and how that can basically help the end user run through the synchronization process in a guided manner. So typically, once the synchronization is over, what we see is there's still a gap of 3 to 6 months, typically depending from customer to customer. So once the synchronization step is done, we can't really directly say that we are now ready to move from ECC to S4HANA, because business partner CVI is just one aspect of it. There are many other aspects as well, starting from finance to logistics, HR, and many other steps that need to be followed. Now, in the process, in the timeline that the synchronization has happened and the real upgrade is yet to happen, there can be some more customer vendor creation, which were not taken care by the synchronization in the earlier step. So we do also provide, we also need to think of a mechanism where we actually are catering to those customer and vendor master data creations, which also need to be converted to business partner for a successful S4HANA upgrade. So that was a brief theoretical business process description on how the business partner CVI business process works as of today. And now I'll just briefly show another diagrammatic explanation as to how exactly the steps that I just walked you through, how exactly that is now brought into the system. What you see on your screen is a brief representation of the system CVI cockpit. And just to talk about the main features that we are looking at when we are talking about the delivery of the CVI cockpit in the standard feature set. To start with, it is first of all the standard structured and a sequential cockpit delivered by SAP. Further to that, it has quite interactive cockpit steps, meaning a master data specialist who will be operating the CVI cockpit can basically set the statuses of the tasks. So basically it is structured, the overall cockpit will be structured into basically a 3-step hierarchy. There'll be an overall status, as you can see over here, overall status at the head, basically, which at any given point of time during the lifetime of the BP synchronization will tell you whether you're ready for, whether your BP synchronization activity has been fully completed for your landscape or not, which essentially means you cannot have any customer or vendor record which is not synchronized to a business partner. I will also talk a bit technically when I get into the system, but this status basically speaks about the fact that whether or not the system, your customer and vendor databases are fully ready with the business partners in the ECC box or not. Followed by 4 stages. What you can see over here, the README, the preparation, the CVI load, and the upgrade preparation. These are the 4 stages that we are looking at, as I also demonstrated in the previous slide where I talked about the business processes, followed by the individual tasks. Now, each stage has several tasks listed under it based on the relevance of the particular business stage that they are into. And for each of these, the user can basically perform those activities and also set a manual status. How the status determination works is something that is better demonstrated in the system. So I'll walk you through around that in the system. So what I mean to highlight over here is it also provides a very flexible sequence controlling, and meaning what happens when and what to do when and what to do next and what not to do next. So there's a sequence involved in this as well. Followed by that, we have a real system-based messaging, meaning as a question might pop up in some of your minds that if the controls are manual, then how exactly are we basically saying? Because for manual controls, there always a scope of error, and to avoid that, we must rely on a system-based messaging. So I'll also walk you through in the system what exactly we mean by a system-based messaging, which basically points to the fact that the overall status of the CVI cockpit will not exactly be green unless and until really in the system all the KNA1 records and LFA1 records, meaning the customer and vendor master data records, have a business partner assigned against them. Unless that in the system has been achieved, the messaging from the CVI cockpit will still show as not ready. No matter what you set in the statuses manually, the overall status of the CVI cockpit is what anyone should look at when they are wanting to understand from the CVI cockpit, are they good to go for the business partner synchronization step? And only after then they are okay to go for an S4 upgrade from a business partner point of view. And the CVI cockpit also provides a very user-friendly documentation. And the documentation talks very clearly about each and every step, and also gives a kind of a user guidance as to how to operate with the buttons and the various tools that are provided. So with that, I will now jump on to the system, and I'll also demonstrate this whole thing in an ECC system, and I'll run through the CVI cockpit for what I have demonstrated in the presentation just now. In case of questions, since I am presenting, I also have 2 more colleagues with me, and you could also write your questions, any technical questions during the runtime of the presentation in the chat, and we will be having a look at the end once the demonstration is over. So as I mentioned, the CVI cockpit is basically available through a transaction code. I am now in an ECC system, and I can launch the CVI cockpit with the help of transaction CVI cockpit. As you can see, I entered the T code, CVI cockpit, and here I am. So as you can see, as I explained, there are 4 tabs which can be seen under, and under each of the tabs stages. So for the sake of functional reference, we will refer to all of these tabs as stages, and the tasks and the executable options underneath it would be the tasks for the stages. So there are in total 4 stages, and each of these stages have a set of tasks underneath them. So the first task talks about the README, as you would have also seen in the business process presentation, that you basically start with a README section wherein the customer gets an information of what exactly are the set of prerequisite notes that you would want to have a look. So if you see the first note checker button, basically lists you all the relevant CVI process relevant notes, and it will basically demonstrate which are the list of notes. It's also available as a transport-based correction instruction, as well as a set of an Excel which has a collective list of all the notes which could not be delivered as part of the transport-based correction instructions. Now, when I say TCI, transport-based correction instructions, this is basically a new mechanism, or rather a new technology delivered from SAP, wherein, this is nothing specific to business partner or CVI functionality as such, but a general new mechanism delivered from SAP, wherein customers need not necessarily deliver or implement each of those notes one by one in the system. Rather, he has a set of correction instructions clubbed together, wherein you can actually club multiple notes into one single transport-based correction instruction. Now, that's something which is delivered separately, which will be available as part of the consulting note when you hit from the CVI cockpit, followed by a CVI library, which is something again which gives you a full documentation list of all the help documentations that needs to be there for the business partner approach, including the link to the central CVI cookbook, as well as all the enhancement frameworks that we have. As you can see, it also talks about the CRM relevant integration notes and the most commonly phased FAQs as well, which basically covers this consulting note, which can be treated as a documentation library for the CVI process. Now, this is pretty much what covers as part of the README section. Coming on to the real executable items, we now come into the preparation stage. So as you can see, each of these stages are having tasks to it, as I mentioned. Each of these tasks, on the other hand, basically will have traffic lights where the user can enable a status to it. Now, just to say a few ground rules about the cockpit, there will be the tasks that you have would be having statuses where you can maintain status manually. The statuses that you maintain for the tasks collectively will automatically determine the status for the stage, and all the stages, the status of the stages, as well as the real entries in the system, together will determine the overall cockpit status. This was just a theoretical explanation. I'll now show you in the system how it happens. Now, let's assume that I am in an ECC system and I am just starting to think of a business partner synchronization process. In a big picture, basically, I want to upgrade to S/4HANA, and I want to start with the business partner synchronization process. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, I would want to look at what is the quality of my customer and vendor master data models right now, and how ready are they to be synchronized through business partner data model. So I will just basically start with executing the CVI cockpit. As you can see, the execute buttons are initially disabled. So one needs to press the edit button and see that this will open up. Now, one important point is, as you can see, when you are, the edit button will be only enabled if the immediate previous tab is set to green. Now, as I proceed in the demonstration, we'll basically get to see how exactly this the sequencing of the CVI cockpit works. So we are only able to press the edit button over here because the previous N-1 stage is set as green, right? If you can see, the further steps, N+2 and N+3 steps, the edit button is disabled. So you can only edit or execute the tasks of a stage, provided the immediate previous stage is set to green. So to start with the master data consistency check, I have already pressed on the execute stage button. The click of for each and every task, you have an information button which tells you what exactly that particular tool or that particular offering solution will do. As you can see, it basically performs the necessary business checks for customer and business vendor master data if you're intending to migrate to S/4HANA, and it also gives you an upfront view of the master data consistency that is required for the conversion to business partner. It also lists the checks, and with that, I'll just click on the execute button itself. As you can see, I have now navigated to another tool which talks about the prevalidation, basically which runs through the entire customer and vendor data sets and sees how ready are the customer and vendor master data models with respect to the business partner data model. As I said, the customer and vendor master data are existing in the system because during creation in XD01 or XK01, there were no errors. However, that does not mean that they are ready to be converted to BP, because the business partner data model expects some specific data to be maintained as well. And the most commonly faced business checks are as listed over here. They could be with the tax code, tax jurisdiction, address, postal code, email, industry, and so on. So you could run any of them over here, and then basically you can actually have a look at what are the checks that you have in the system over here. And basically, it also provides an inline mechanism where you can get onto XD02 and do a correction directly. So this is the report which basically talks about correcting the master data for these checks, and you can then rerun your report to see whether those errors have now gone or not. Now, once you're done with this, you can basically confirm, let's say I have addressed all of those errors which were reported and I want to set the status of the CVI cockpit. Now, as a master data specialist, I can confirm that this is done. If you click on the status button, you see there are for each and every task, these are the following statuses that can be present in the CVI cockpit. Well, the default one is initial, and followed by these set of values, which says either it needs resolution or it is in process, or something which is not relevant, then you can skip it, but that would be a project decision, followed by OK or OK with resolvation, or something which was not working and is now resolved, so you can press resolve. So since I'm operating the master data check report for the first time, and I assume that I have corrected all the errors reported, so I'll press 05, and I need to maintain a comment over here, because that would be, system will not allow me to go ahead without that. And I'll mention over here, master data consistency report errors corrected. And if you see over here, it also tells you who has maintained the last comment for the status. As you see, it takes my user ID, and it also updates when I have updated that. It also persists the date. So I can now move on to the next step, which talks about the CVI customizing. Now this will take me to another tool, another report, which basically enlists all the specific customer supplier to business partner direction checks. If you can see over here, I will select the customer or vendor to BP direction, because in ECC that would be the direction I'm concerned with. It will show you the necessary role to account group and account group to business partner grouping to be maintained. It will tell you what are the current inconsistencies with respect to the IMG activities in the system right now. It is quite an elaborate report. It also proposes you which particular account groups are currently not maintained. As you can see, it tells you the information around the role mapping, consistencies, and so on. You can move on further as well to see the contact person specific checks. As you can see over here, in case a specific, now we all know for the customer contact persons, there are a set of customizings which needs to be taken care because the contact persons would also be synchronized to BP. Now there are a separate set of customizings available in for the ECC scenario and for the BP scenario. So it is necessary for CVI to make sure that both these customizing tables on both ends are in sync and the mapping is in place correctly. So the specific checks are for departments, for functions, for maintaining authority of the contact person, a VIP indicator, marital status, and so on. Right. So with that, you can see that we are providing inline correction possibilities as well. You can correct the things here in line. It will prompt you for a customizing request and so on. So this was more around the custom CVI customizing possibilities that we just spoke of. Without spending much time, we can head back to the CVI cockpit and see how we can proceed further. Yeah, okay. So here I am again back to the cockpit. I was just walking you briefly through the CVI customizing report, and now also assuming that I have actually resolved all these errors, and I say that, hey, I'm okay with this as well. So I'll just set the current status as I saw to 05, and I can maintain a status called customizing errors resolved. Sorry about that. Customizing. And I set the status as green. The same behavior happens again. And assuming that there are, so again, I spoke of a suppression check mechanism. Specific checks there is a possibility in the customer's sandbox systems where you could suppress few of the checks. Now you can see over here, few of the data sets like tax jurisdiction, email, tax numbers, regional postcode can be suppressed. Meaning if I suppress it at this level, when I move on to the next step, that is the CVI load, those specific checks would be suppressed. Now, there's an important thing I would like to mention for this particular thing is it can be slightly risky to operate this step in a production environment. Typically, we would like to cover these steps during the sandbox or a quality system itself, that we ensure that the data is consistent and a synchronization has happened, and then we proceed with that. So we do not recommend to run the suppression checks, which is essentially a customizing table in the production environment. And just in case a customer or a consultant is really struggling with the synchronization step and some of the errors are known to him, then and then only he should proceed and suppress a particular check, because eventually the checks are here for a reason. And if the checks are really resolved, that can only lead to the fact that you'll have a smoother life for that particular customer or vendor when you have moved on to the S4 landscape. Yeah. So with that, assuming that this is also achieved by the end user, I'll place this also as 05, maintain a comment. And interestingly, now you can see the CVI load, since this particular stage is now set as green, the edit button has opened up for this step. So with that, we move on to the third stage. Here, basically, we are now in the CVI load stage. As you can see, it is divided into 3 steps. One is the preload activities. Under the preload activities, you can already have a look. There are a set of interfaces that you need to fix, the set of interfaces that you need to address over here. Yeah, so there are a set of activities or tasks you need to perform before really going into the load tool. The load tool is nothing but the MDS load cockpit, which was the only standard tool provided for the business partner synchronization process prior to this. So it briefly talks about the documentation briefly talks about what all are the activities that you need to do specifically for activation and deactivation of interfaces, which are the inbound and outbound based on the direction of synchronization that you need to activate prior to the load process, which are the maintenance transactions that you need to block, and so on, right? So this all can be done when you basically click the edit button, and you can proceed and operate and execute these steps one by one. So in the interest of time, I'll proceed with this thing because the system is designed in a way that we must go through all the steps and then only proceed to the next step. Block the maintenance transactions. Okay. This is again a documentation step only. Okay. Followed. Then we move on to the real load tool. As you can see, once the prerequisite activities has been done, you can see the stage has turned to yellow because the stage basically depends on the parameter, it depends on the statuses of the tasks that you have manually maintained underneath it. So since a lot of tasks are yet to be completed, the status of this is now yellow, means which is in progress. But then in case any of the statuses is set to red, the overall stage will become red. Now there's a detailed manual which would also explain the behavior at all point of time. You can always refer to the help. Whatever I'm demonstrating is well captured in this help documentation over here, which I'll walk through at the end. And followed by the real load tool. You can see this is the real load tool, which will take you to the main synchronization cockpit, which is basically the MDS load cockpit, as you can see. And you have to choose the business partner to customer or business partner to vendor direction. Typically, for an ECC scenario, it would be customer vendor to BP direction. And there are some further checks which you can run. This is a tool I'm supposing would be familiar to many of you because this was the standard solutioning available before this, prior to the CVI cockpit. And now this has also been integrated to it, followed by the post-processing because the load tool will give you errors. And to give the error, to correct the errors, you need to access the PPO framework, which is here from the CVI cockpit. We provide a further filtration option saying that you want to address only the customer errors or the vendor errors. It asks for a date. Just to narrow down the number of errors, you can actually also fill in a date over here, assuming I give the date of November to today's date. And we will be led to the screen which lists in detail what are the customer-centric errors which are logged in the PPO interface for them to be fixed. Right now, from then we can come back to assuming that all the errors and the entries are fixed. We then move on to the next task. There's a completeness check as well, which talks about now this, as I probably you'll find the system relevance over here. This completeness check button basically talks about once that the load tool has run and the post-processing framework has also run, because here basically the solutions are listed in the intended sequence. Stage-wise, it goes from left to right, and the task-wise, it goes from top to bottom. And assuming that we have finished the post-processing as well, and then we move on to the completeness check, meaning at the synchronization phase itself, you're basically asking the end user that, hey, have you completed the full synchronization process for all the customers and vendors in your system? Now, if you say that this is completed, meaning if you have 100 customers, 100 vendors, you should have 100 entries in CVI cust link and CVI event link tables, which are the linkage tables for the customer, vendor, and business partner data models. So ideally, system does a check at that point of time. And if the end user is basically setting this stage as complete, as you can see, it prompts for an error. It says that, hey, in the system, you still have unsynchronized customer and supplier data. Do you really want to change the status? Only if he still persists, wants to change, then he can change, and not otherwise. And once this is done, they would have the next set of steps, that is the activation, deactivation of interfaces, wherein after the synchronization is done, he wants to deactivate and unblock the transactions that he had previously done prior to synchronization. So once that is done, you can see that the stage turns green, and the next step is now open for editing. Now, as I mentioned in the presentation as well, typically when the synchronization happens, when the synchronization step happens, and the S4 upgrade happens from the third step to the fourth step. Typically, there's a lag of 3 to 6 months, as we have experienced from some customer feedbacks as well. And what can happen during this time is, although the synchronization master data specialist has said that the synchronization is complete, but then we would still like to actually, we can't really restrict the customer and vendor creation in the system in the meantime. In the sense, let's assume that we are talking about a timeline of August to October when we are running the business partner synchronization. And in this timeline, we ensure that the MBS load cockpit runs and converts all the then existing customers and vendors to BP. However, the S4 go live is planned for January, and in the meantime, from October to January, there can still be customers and vendors being created. We need to have a look at that as well, because when we are going for the S4 upgrade, that is when the SUM or the software upgrade manager runs, at that point of time, we are not allowed to have any unsynchronized customers or vendors in the system. So hence comes the need of the stage 4, which I am going to walk you through now. This basically gives you a list of two tools, a couple of tools basically, because typically whenever a customer and vendor is created, you would have errors as well, and then those errors need to be fixed. Those errors need to be fixed from the PPO tool. It gives you another chance to reprocess those errors, and followed by an upgrade check report, which basically lists you a final health check before the software upgrade manager comes into the picture, wherein you can actually see what are the final amount of customizing or the vendor checks or the linkages which are not yet there in the system. It quantifies you a result where you can see that, okay, still there are these many customers not synchronized in the system, and you can again iterate the process starting from preparation to resolve those errors again. So assuming that is resolved, we can again move ahead. So now you can see that all the 4 stages are set to green, but then still the overall status says red. Now that's just because of the fact that there is a real-time system-based status messaging, and the real-time status will always tell you that the overall cockpit is successful only when all stages are confirmed and there are no unsynchronized records in the system. So since for the sake of demonstration, I have just set the status as to green, system basically now blocks me, says that, hey, you are not really good to go with the overall status because there are still these many unsynchronized entries in the system, right? So in the interest of time, I think this was more about the CVI cockpit in the ECC landscape. And I'm sure there must be many questions that you would already have. And with that, I would like to open the floor for questions on the new CVI cockpit.
Thank you, Saptarshi. It was really a huge amount of information. So there has been a question also in the question and answer section. But I can see in the meanwhile, it has already been answered, and also in the chat window. So if you want to speak up, you can just hover over your name and raise your hand, and then I can unmute the attendee so that you can speak up. You have also the chance to just write the question in the chat here.
Just to also add few cents over here, I've also listed in the presentation the OSS note number with which the CVI cockpit is available, followed by the link of a blog which we have recently published, which talks in and out around the CVI cockpit as such.
Perfect. And there is one more question in the chat window.
Yeah, so I see a question. Hi, this is an ECC system. What will happen for more than one system, like different CRM systems, etc., with duplicates? Will the CVI handle this? The first release of the CVI cockpit does not cater to a wide scope, as you have mentioned, for multiple ECC systems. Typically, we are looking at a single system transformation to S/4HANA. No, this has not to do with MDG yet. If you can see over here, even our help documentation maintains a specific section called what is out of scope. It also lists that the MDG capability and the CRM integrated scenarios are not included in the feature scope right now, and it specifically. Yeah, so basically it is an in-system synchronization which does which only takes care of the customer and vendor master data which are present in-house in the system. I see a question which says, can you talk about the options? Do you have your create the fields in BP and then migrate the data? Well, it is, I suppose you're referring to a BP to customer vendor synchronization scenario where the BP is created first and then the synchronization. So typically what I have just explained is something that talks about a typical customer vendor to business partner direction, and the business partners are created in the synchronization phase and then are migrated onto S/4HANA with the help of through the software update manager, which transform into S/4HANA. I also see a question around the contact person creation for BP. Well, at the moment, the contact person objects are not a part of the CVI cockpit. Meaning what we are looking at over here are specifically the LFA1 and the KNA1 entries only, and not the KNVK entries, which are containing the contact person information as well. I see another question saying, are there any other manual steps that may be required outside CVI cockpit based on your experience with customers? Well, if we are looking at a customer vendor to business partner conversion scenario, then the CVI cockpit and the existing offerings in the intended sequence should do a comprehensive job for you, and it should take care of the end-to-end processes. However, if in case a customer is having additional data sets like HCM or a CRM specific scenarios, those are not a part of the scope at the moment in the first release. We spoke about custom fields, which are not a part of the CVI cockpit scope right now. However, as part of one of the offerings, that is the master data check report, which is the first, one of the first steps that you can see. There is a possibility to add some custom checks because there's a provision of a baddie. However, it doesn't really directly correspond to the offerings in the CVI cockpit at the moment.
So there's also a question from Attia. He wants to speak up. So I think you are unmuted now. You can speak.
Sure. Thank you so much. Hi, Sen. This is Satya. You have just answered to my question regarding the MDG thing. That is clear to me. But the other question that I have is like, this is just a manual step configuration that you're doing based on each and every step that you complete. You're just coming and checking what is being corrected or something. Is it like my understanding true? And then the same CVI settings need to be set up in the other system where you're going to migrate it. Oh, sorry. Same system, it's but just an upgrade.
That's right. So basically, we are talking about a brownfield scenario here. Basically, what happens over here is, you're right, your understanding is right. So what happens over here is, when you press the execute buttons, if you want to go to a section, let's say, I would just again take the reference of this particular stage. Let's say we want to go to a particular report. Now, when you run through this report, and you make sure that all these errors, now there are reports which will basically show you the list of errors. It will show you, hey, you have 100 inconsistencies at this moment. Like over here, you can see CVI link vendor. It says that out of 1059 LFA1 entries, 504 are still unsynchronized, right? Now it is the end user's decision when he gets to know that, yes, I have fixed all of that. Now on that, SAP does not have a control. So this particular step can be set only by the end user manually, right? So when this happens, when this particular step is set by the end user, cumulatively based on all these tasks, programmatically the stage status is determined. So only when both of these are green, the stage will turn green.
Okay.
Okay. And now there can also be a risk of manual maintenance. We mitigate that risk by doing a system check. That's what I meant when I said system-based messaging. Basically, this particular button that you see over here, at all point of time, this will tell you that how many unsynchronized customers and vendors exist in the system right now. This is a safeguarding mechanism, meaning even due to any human error, if you have set all of them as green, that doesn't necessarily indicate from SAP's system that you're ready to go for an BP. Your BP synchronization is complete, because in the system there are still unsynchronized entries.
Okay.
I hope that clarifies.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you also. And in regards to the time, I have in the meanwhile uploaded here our poll. So I kindly ask the attendees to take part in it, so that we have a better overview of what your needs are. And there is one more open question in the Q&A section in the bottom. So it said separate license or part of S4. I don't know if this helps you to answer. Maybe this is our last one, and then we close the call.
So yeah, I'm sorry, I can't see the question in the chat box.
No problem. This is from Varun, and he said only separate license or part of S4.
This CVI cockpit is delivered as part of the ECC landscape, and it is available by default in the standard feature set. There is no separate license required.
Okay, perfect. Then I thank you very much for you, Saptarshi, for presenting this huge topic, and all the attendees for taking part. We will upload the presentation to our SAP Community YouTube channel, and I've also pasted the recording upload link here in the chat. And you, Saptarshi, can also decide if you want to provide the presentation also. If so, please send it to me. And yeah, that's all from our side. Thank you very much, everyone. I will close the recording now.
Sure. Thank you so much, Svea. And I would like